Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another aircon edition of a talk. Today we're talking about FMOD. And I'm hoping that you get to learn something that you didn't know before. Maybe you're a beginner, or maybe you've been using it for a couple of years or something, but maybe hopefully I'll be able to show something that you can take away. I like that idea, the idea that you watch a talk and you get at least one idea, and that's what makes it worth it. So that's my intention. If I if I start veering off tangents or getting slower as I speak, that's because I'm exhausted. I am in the middle of moving. It's a mess in here. Look, there are bananas everywhere. There's just stuff on the floor. It's just, I got here, I set it up. I set up my computer, my Mac computer, not the PC stuff, just for this specifically, so we can have a good time and then go from there. Anyway, so yes, hopefully everybody gives me some questions and some energy to keep going. Right, enough about moving. I'm going to stop talking about myself. Right, if you are wanting to follow along, I kind of wanted this to be like a kind of follow along thing. So if anybody has FMOD open with them, it doesn't have to be the same version we're using, but you know, out of curiosity, we are using version 2.02.13, but it doesn't matter as long as you have a 2.0 version. I'm going to be going through a couple like events and tips and tricks that I use in the second half of this webinar. And at some point I'll be like, if you want to follow along, I'm going to, you know, I'll just make one from scratch and you can kind of just go through the motions of doing it yourself, which might be useful. For me, it's useful to repeat something as soon as I learn it, so to speak. So as soon as I, you know, practicing it, having it in my hands means I have a history of doing it, practice. So that's the sort of live follow along level that we're going for. Okay. Great. And yes, the other thing is that I'm going to be answering questions throughout the whole thing. There's not going to be like at the end. It's kind of like if you see something you want to know more about, put it in the chat and I will periodically check the chat and answer some questions. Okay. So feel free, go for it. This is your chance, you know? Cool. Right. Let's start then. So I'm going to do this in two parts. This first project, I'm going to be showing how I set things up in terms of, oh, and I'll tell you what I've just realized. That I won't be able to see the chat like this. So can I view this as a gallery and okay, give me 1 second. Just realized if I can't see the chat, then I'm not going to be able to answer any questions, am I? Sergio, come on. Toggle screen sharing. Right, let's try a window. Okay, cool. That makes a lot more sense. Right, here we go. Everyone see that okay? Which one should you download? FMOD Studio. Excellent first question. So yes, on the website you have FMOD Studio engine, and then you have integration packages. I want you to download FMOD Studio if you're wanting to follow along. FMOD Studio is this. Okay? This is the app itself. The other stuff is to do with integration stuff with depending on what the game engine that you're using. Okay? So this is FMOD Studio. This is usually what it looks like when you first open it, right? Gives you the version number there. And the online manuals, which are very good. They're very comprehensive. I mean, obviously you have to read, which is a bummer, but yeah, they're very good. The other thing I wanted to mention, if you don't know a question, if you don't know an answer to something, or you have, you know, you're looking for answers, the FMOD forum, the official FMOD forum is really, really good as well. Like you obviously have to set up an account to download in the first place, and then you use that account to ask questions. They have official moderators, and they also have, you know, people just chiming in. It's great. It's just a great, I use it all the time. Everybody uses it. So when in doubt, check out the forum. Can everybody hear me okay? Everything's good. Everything's nice, loud and clear. I might also play something just really quick. Just tell me if you can hear a sound. Does that sound again? Okay, good. Awesome. Perfect. Okay, so great. So what I am gonna, the best sounding 1 second of a song you've ever heard. Right. What I'm gonna do is show you what I kind of do to set up a project like a blank project or a template, if you will, for a video game that you're just about to start. You can hear me, but you can barely hear the FMOD. Okay, that's good to know. I will. I tell you what. I will. Let's do a little sound check here because that's going to be important. I'm going to turn down my mic, and you guys can turn up your volumes. How's that? How's that? 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check. 1, 2. Is that a better balance? Can't hear FMOD. Oh yeah, you couldn't hear FMOD either. That's because of a volume thing? Oh, still no FMOD. So there's no FMOD at all. Oh, okay. So there isn't FMOD. Interesting. Okay. This must be a share thing. Audio output. It is set to there. Okay. If there's no FMOD, if there's no no, there's not an OBS issue. It'd be a live streaming thing for FMOD itself. It's a Microsoft virtual thing. That was hearable before a tap sound, or was it something else? You need to screen share. Yeah, no, I thought I was screen sharing, but let's start again. What do you mean the entire screen? Is that what you're saying? Okay, how about this? No? I'm waiting for somebody to catch up with what I've just done. You can't hear that? Nope. Oh, for goodness sake. All right. Well, we'll just have to leave it. If somebody jumps on, like Greg or someone, I don't think anybody shared FMOD before. They shared Reaper, but I don't think that's worked. I mean, you think you changed the screen? The screen app. Yeah, I know, but I don't have... Interesting. Probably because I'm on a Mac. All right. It's not important. It's not important. I will... the thing that I'm showing you today is mainly the setup and mainly the techniques, and it's still very relevant for you to follow along and stuff like that. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Right. I'm going to turn my mic up. I will enjoy the music, and I'll tell you how great the music is. How's that? Okay. So I'm going to be talking through about how I set up a project and kind of the general things that I do, because I know that certain things are going to show up regardless of what you're trying to do in a project, right? Just general things, right? So the first thing is organization, and it's usually better to follow a certain kind of naming convention, a certain kind of organization, folder organization kind of convention. You don't have to follow what everybody else does, but the resources that are out there are really great places to start, right? One of the best places to start, actually, I'm going to share just the screen, is there's a GDC talk by Hexany Audio, and I will find what that is. I'll send you a link momentarily. Hexany Audio is a really great place to start. They have a really great resource, and I tend to use this loosely because there's always differences and nuances depending on what project you're using and things that you want to change. But here in my notes thing, the first thing that I can do is, by the way, you can add an event and you can just type in notes, right? And down here, if I scroll down here, right, you can literally just type in notes. In my case, I don't know, I just put an example of putting like the naming convention. So if anybody opens them, then you can check that the developer and anybody else working on the project can see what you're using as a naming convention. Lewis, if you're here, I'm having trouble sharing audio, but it might be a Mac thing. Okay. If you have any suggestions like on the fly, it's not a big deal, but if you do, now that you're here. So yeah, I have an event just added for notes. I stole this, by the way, from this idea from a lot of these ideas, by the way, are stolen from other people. One of them is Kevin's, Kevin Regami's project from Celeste, or the Power Up team FMOD project from the game Celeste, which they have uploaded for free on the FMOD website. So if you go to the FMOD website and you go to the Learn tab, then no, I don't have loopback. So let's just forget about it. Thank you anyway. If you go to fmod.com and you go to the Learn tab, you will find the project for Celeste and a bunch of other stuff like articles and interviews, one from like the Untitled Goose Game. But yeah, Kevin did this as well just to kind of explain what's going on in the FMOD project. And I've been doing it ever since because it's a great idea. So that being said, following that naming convention GDC talk from Richard Ludlow from Hexany Audio and using the Celeste project, I've basically come up with this idea that every game has characters, every game has environmentals, music, NPCs, and UI. Enemy is something that I've chosen to add to this project as an example that you can, go deviate slightly away from the norms if you want. Enemies really should be NPCs if we're speaking accurately. If we're being honest, they're kind of NPCs. However, they kind of also deserve their own little thing, their own little space in the game. So that's kind of what I do. So ignore the examples part. This is what I add to a project. Straight away, bunch of folders, right? FMOD is also really great because you can add colors. Wise, you can add colors as well, I know. But yeah, you can change colors, so do it. Like, what better than to add colors and make everything less gray? Great, so that's the first thing I do. And then within each one of these, again, the first thing that I know we're going to have is a player, right? No matter what, every game is going to have a player, somebody to play as, usually. If it's not, then if it's like if it's like a city building game or something like that, then perhaps not. But anyway, stuff like this could be one template for a player-driven, character-driven kind of video game. And I had a bunch of these events just ready, right? Which again has helped like on numerous occasions. I can just open it up and just start. The same with the enemy if I wanted to, whatever. Inside the environment, again, following the naming convention, I put stuff like ambience and interactables, right? Interactables, which I don't think is a word, but we understand what that means because we play video games, right? So interactables, so things that we have to interact with. So like a lever to open a door or a button, whatever, interactables, still part of the environment, right? Cool. That's really simple. Where we are right now in FMOD is the event editor, right? The event editor is where we add our events, quite simply. So for instance, if I go back to character and then player, now I open this event that I've just added. You can right click, by the way, and add new event anywhere you want, right? I've added an event here, and this is my timeline, my audio track timeline. In here is where I can drag and drop audio files from outside of FMOD or from within the assets tab, which we're going to explore in a minute. I can drag them in here and add sounds. Do I have sounds here? Look, I've got some generic sounds I threw in, right? And also, here's a trick if anybody knows FMOD. You can zoom into this because it's not to scale, or you can click out and click back in, and hey, it's zoomed in for you, right? Even better. And there you go. I've got a sound, and I'm playing it. It sounds so good. I wish you could hear how amazing this sounds. It's the most blood generic slash sound you've ever heard. Right. There we go. So there you go. This is the event editor. So I can add all these events, add audio here. I can add return tracks. I can add audio tracks. This is very much like a DAW. It should be quite, quite intuitive if you use a DAW, which I'm sure we all do, right? You've got the play button, you've got the beats and time and information up here. And then on each track, you can add effects, plugins, if you will, right? Just like in a DAW. It's got all of these live processing plugins, which we'll cover a little bit in a little while, right? You can add sends as well, pre and post fader as well, if you're into, getting into the nitty gritty and details of your signal chains and stuff. And yeah, there you have it, right? This is the event editor. Here is the spatializer. It's a preview window for spatializing how things sound in 3D. Again, we will cover that in a second. Cool. Right, the other windows, the other tabs that we want to talk about in the event editor is stuff in the banks and the assets tab, right? So banks, it starts by default with a master bank. And what a bank is, if you're not familiar, is where we essentially build and load our sounds into so that it can then be loaded into the game engine. So Unity or Unreal loads a bank of sounds. It's like compressing all of our FMOD project into this smaller file, and then it just gets loaded when it's needed. So by default, it has a master bank, which is everything, which is fine. However, we don't always want to load every sound at the same time because it might be quite taxing on the CPU. It's also unnecessary if we're playing sounds from like level 10 and we're on level 1 and we're not going to hear those sounds. That's why we can make other ones. It's quite common to make one bank for music, for instance, one bank for sound effects, and then again, this could be taken even further. This could be taken as level 1 sound effects, right? And I can put that into a subfolder, or I can't. Here we go. I can put these into subfolders like sound effects of the gameplay. I'll just put level 1 in there. Okay. That's really up to you. But again, generally speaking, you want one for music. Sound effects might be broken down into levels or stages or areas, and then UI, because UI is like menu. It's totally separate. Okay. There's a question. Are you using timeline sheets as template? What do you mean by that? Each one of these sheets as a template? No, these are just standard events, if that's what that means. Your timeline sheet looks different to this. It only gives me a master track. How interesting. Is that because you're using an actions? Perhaps. There's an actions sheet and there's a timeline sheet. But there's only ever one, yeah. There's only parameters, action sheets, or timeline sheets. Actions are simply for like if you want to play one sound in the event and you don't want to do anything else. Timeline is where you can start adding events like we did to this slash sound and like start using it like a door, right? Adding fades and stuff, editing it. If that makes sense. Cool. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Right, where were we? We were in banks. Okay, so that should be banks pretty much covered. That's something to look into, something to think about. But for the most part, you'd be covered to begin with having these three, okay? Each event, you can see all of these are unassigned on this side. Yep, that's because I haven't added any of these to a bank. That means that even if I push this to the developers, this whole project, they won't see my sounds connecting to the game engine until I right-click, assign to a bank, and I choose the one that I want to assign it to. Okay? Really simple stuff. Again, nothing more needs to be said. Right, your assets. Assets also needs to be kept in pretty good order, right? This is like your originals folder in Wise, if anybody knows Wise. Again, I'm following pretty much the same naming convention that you use in from the resource that I sent you, the GDC one, right? Enemies, environment. There's 2 environments for some reason, but anyway, interactables, music, NPCs. This is where you tend to drag your assets into, right? So everything's neat and tidy, especially when you get bigger projects. If you need to go into the audio bin and find out, find where one of these assets were that you imported into FMOD, this needs to be nice and tidy. The same reason why we keep the originals folder in Wise nice and tidy for that reason. That's it. Really simple stuff. I'm going to go into a couple other things because I'm going to go into more detail about all of this stuff, the event editor, with the tips and tricks that I'm going to show you later on. So that being said, there are more windows. Hey, the mixer. Everybody loves a mixer. Can everybody still see this? No. Because we're no longer sharing that. So I just opened a new window. I can see it, but you can't. So here we go. Right. I just went into window and I opened the new mixer, right? Event editor was here. Mixer's here. That's where we are. Cool. Right. Okay. Also, really quick question. So Ariel said, I wondered the same thing. I put everything in the master bank, but maybe it's better if it's a really big game to split them up. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. It's just more efficient. It's also a nice way of compartmentalizing your game and telling, the the developer that each level has its own bank. It makes things a lot smoother. We're going to be talking about CPU considerations in a little while, but that's generally a good approach. Really depends on each game. If it's a small enough game, one bank might be enough. It's still preferable to have all your music in like one place, especially music, because music tends to be very big files. Right, so this is the mixer. Everybody has a mixer. Everybody knows mixers and DAWs, hopefully. Very, very similar case here. We have faders for each big subgroup that we have. So we have the master bus by default. I like to add one underneath because I'm anal about things and I just want my own master bus that I've created for some reason. Maybe it gives me more flexibility and controllability. I don't know. And then again, so we have gameplay sound effects I put one for music and again, one for UI. Because generally speaking, we want to be able to, like the menu, like the audio settings in a game menu, we tend to like to be able to turn down the sound effects with one fader, turn down the music with one fader, and the UI, right? And then some people use like ambience in a separate one every now and then. But for the most part, sound effects, music, UI, right? Cool. As you can see, I have the paths of the events that I've made in the event editor, right? Under the UI, under gameplay, there is an event called objective activate, right? But these are out of the folder. The reason why naming things is so important is because if again, this is a very simple example, but imagine this was full of like thousands of events or instances, right? If I type in something in the search bar and I type in UI, only stuff that correlates with UI will come up, which means I can highlight all of these, drag them into their relevant folder, and I'm done, right? Naming conventions. Very, very important. Any tips on best practices for reverb setup in FMOD? Yes, I will get onto that in the second half of this. I'd like to set up a second reverb that is applied when sounds are included through walls, but adding a reverb to each event seems like madness. It is madness. I will show you a much easier way. Can events be loaded into a game engine from more than one bank at the same time? Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Just imagine that having it separated into different banks means that the banks that don't need to be loaded is memory that's being saved or time processing power being saved, right? If everything was in one bank, that bank is then, it takes essentially longer to load. The differences are very minimal, but it takes longer. It's a bigger bank. One more question before I continue. Is FMOD a good option to start with to dive in and use on real team projects, or is it better to start Wise? Okay, I said this the other day. I always say this. Wise and FMOD both do exactly the same thing. They're both fantastic pro softwares. There's even more coming out recently, one called Elias, which I've heard good things about as well. But if we just focus on the two big ones, Wise and FMOD, they're both fantastic. They both tackle game audio very well in slightly different ways. Okay, and it's really the kind of the same argument between doors. Which one's better, right? Down to preference. There is just one consideration, and that is if you want to go into in-house studio work, if you want to be a AAA composer, more often than not, the words that come up on the applications are Wise and Reaper. Lately, it's more often than not. Wise for sure comes up way more than FMOD, and that's just because it's kind of like I don't want to say the Pro Tools because it's better than Pro Tools, but it's kind of like the Pro Tools of the game audio industry, right? It's like the industry standard. Like it's an older software and the biggest studios trust it because of that, I believe. However, if you want to be freelance like I am, then pick the one that you want. I chose FMOD because it looks pretty. It's just nice. Look at it. It looks like a DAW. I'm familiar. I know where I am inside of it. Wise was just, it's like a programmer's heaven. For me, it's just not the one. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I'm going to continue, then I'll get back to the other questions. So we'll go back and forth a little bit. On each of one of these group sends down here, I can add plugins, right? Just like in the event editor, in each event, right? Down here, again, generally speaking, I just slap a limiter on the master bus, no matter what project, just a limiter, that's it, with like a ceiling of like -2, -2.5, whatever. Just to cover myself, like whilst I'm working in it, in case anything explodes or starts distorting, it's not going to happen, right? I mean, I'm taking some sort of control. But again, each group can have its own effect. For instance, in the gameplay sound effects, I have a low pass filter happening. I'll show you why in like literally just a second. But you can basically add sound effects to massive groups of sound effects, right? Just like a send in a DAW. VCAs. VCAs stand for V, C, and A. I can't remember what they stand for, if they stand for anything. VCAs are really simple. They're just a way of controlling the volume aside from using the routing, using the group buses, okay? All you can do is control the volume. So again, I added one for gameplay, one for music, and one for UI. And then what we simply do is go over here, right-click on gameplay, and assign it to VCA. Okay, and you can see it's already ticked because I've already added it. Right? And this VCA shows up over here in the middle. I can change this fader. It's just another level of controllability. Voltage control amp. That sounds pretty correct. There you go. I prefer my name. VCA is just VCA. VCA stands for VCA. Right. That's very simple. Where it gets interesting is if, for instance, in the gameplay sound effects, right? If I go here and if I assign this gameplay sound effects, maybe in one level, I also want to, I don't know, add a new VCA that's totally unique to that level, right? So let's call it, I don't know, level 1. And in that, if I had, say, the character, I just wanted the character to be in this one, I could put level 1. And then I could also add, oh, I got to take away UI. There we are. Maybe I just wanted the character and I wanted one of the music levels. Let's imagine this is one of the music groups or tracks. I can add them both to level 1 and then mix their volume together, right? Which could be really interesting. It could, you know, again, more flexibility, right? For specific scenarios. Cool. Okay. Last thing before I answer some questions. Snapshots. Snapshots are fantastic. Really simply put, they are like one button a click away from snapping something into a complete change, right? You're snapping the mix into a new sort of change, and you have to do this action when you put one in. It's very important. So again, I set up groups here, right? I've just set up a group very generically, high, medium, and low priority. Stuff that's like, you know, really important, and the stuff that's that will be overridden by these ones, because this is a priority. This is a hierarchy. So whatever you put on top, right, will override the bottom two or whatever other ones that you add, okay? So in high priority, for instance, I've added, again, very generic ones, which pretty much come up in nearly every game, is a sound effects all mute, a music all mute, and a pause menu. And we'll talk about the pause menu in a minute. Sound effects all mute is, again, part of the audio settings. If you want in the it could be part of the audio settings implementation in like the settings of the game. It could also help you with the mix if you just want to quickly just turn off all the sound effects for whatever reason. And basically what it is you can see these like, as I select one of the snapshots, these come out in dotted green lines, which means that whatever I touch here, for instance, this one, has now been changed. This is where the snapshot is going to change the volume, right? And this is the bus for sound effects, which means that every time I press this, every time this snapshot is called upon in the code, I press play, the volume will drop down to 0, right? Same thing for the music. The music on the music bus, it will drop down to 0 when this is played. Pause menu, right? We're going to go into the pause menu. Pause menu, I want to add a filter to everything, right? In order for the music, if you know you're playing in the middle of a gameplay, kind of like, you know, Ghost of Tsushima did this, like that's the first game that comes to my mind. You're playing in the middle of combat and you press pause, the audio kind of filters out, or the music filters out, right? Kind of helping emphasize the idea that you've paused the game, right? So again, down here, I've added a low pass filter already, and there's a cutoff, and I've added it to the music, right? You can see here I've got music selected, and down here there's a low pass filter, right? So I've just right click, gone down to FMOD deprecated, and I've added a low pass filter. And having selected, see, if I deselect it, there's no dotted line. I have to select the music one up here, pause menu, and now I can make my changes. So now I'm just going to set it to the value that I want, something around here. which means if I go back to the event editor and I literally open another window, press play, and then you come back to the snapshots window, click on pause menu and press play, it will filter or do whatever you've done to change it. If I wanted to lower the volume at the same time, it would do that as well. I could press play and it would lower the volume and it would also filter out the sound. There you go. Again, this is one tiny little idea. Imagine what you could do with this with, like, I don't know, specific situations, like some really interesting snapshots. Snapshots are also really great for reverb. You'll see that I've got a reverb here, right? And on each one of these, I could put a send. So let's imagine that this reverb is exterior reverb. Let's call it like that. Okay. Down here, first, let's look at this. This is cool, by the way. On the reverb plugin, if I right click and I go to defaults, there are so many defaults. I can click one of these. This is an exterior one. So let's go for mountains, right? This is a supposedly mountains kind of reverb. Great. It's a good starting point. I start with these all the time and then customize them for the game. If we go to our snapshots now and we add in the high priority, let's add a new snapshot, overriding snapshot, and we type in exterior reverb. Okay. Exterior reverb, if I have this selected and I go to my gameplay sound effects, and first of all, I add a send to the exterior reverb that we've made. Yeah, the menu was invisible. Oops. The menu was invisible. I'm going to fix this right now. Entire screen. There we go. Okay, can we see this? You're going to have to see your chat at the same time. I apologize. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Keeping up. You can see that now, yeah? Yeah, we're good. Right-click on reverb and you go to defaults. Right? So all these defaults. So what I just selected mountains, right? So it looks like a mountains. I'm going to take that off because that's part of the snapshot at the moment. So, excuse me. So what I've done in the snapshots is I've created a external reverb one, right? We've all seen this, okay? And I've selected it. It's highlighted. See, everything goes up dotted green. And now I can go, whilst it's selected, go back to routing, go to external, go to where I want the reverb to be added, which is here, the send. And then I can say, I don't know, let's put it at 0, full volume, which means as the player walks outside, the code can call upon this snapshot. The snapshot will then press play essentially in FMOD and trigger this reverb send to be on full, which means all of the gameplay sound effects now has reverb on full because they are outside. And then when we enter somewhere else, this snapshot doesn't get called or it gets stopped, which means the reverb gets turned all the way back down again, right? Cool, right? Snapshots are really cool. They're really cool for mixing as well, like different scenarios. Maybe you come up against a certain boss or a certain environment which needs something to be amped up a little bit. In an instant, they're done. Right, okay. I've spent a long time on snapshots. There were some questions. FMOD looks less spooky than wise. That's a very apt description. Right. Yes, Henry Scott. By the way, Henry's like a mate of mine. He's now working at Remedy in Finland. He's absolutely killing it. His resources on FMOD are fantastic. Please check out his YouTube channel. He also has a course which I took as well in Unity, also in FMOD and Wise and Unreal, I believe as well. Fantastic courses. Highly, highly recommend them. Basic question. How did you get to this page? I clicked the button that got to basic mix view, but it doesn't seem to be on the same page you're currently on. So sorry, Jax. I hope this is answered now. Yeah, okay. That was probably me sharing stuff that wasn't right. I read somewhere in FMOD forums that the new multi-band EQ is much more efficient than the deprecated LFC. Yep, very, very possible. Do you have use cases for snapshots and parameters? So again, great question, Alex. Exterior reverb, like each type of reverb or generic, general reverbs, that's a use case. That's a pretty good use case. For parameters, it really depends on what you're doing. I tend to use fewer parameters. I tend to use like one parameter and then reuse it for every event. For instance, if I was in the music, which we're going to go in a minute, I'll show you in a minute. I'll show you in a minute if that's all right. like I'll use like a health parameter, and that health parameter will be used on every music track. And that's because not every music track will be playing at the same time, right? So I can just use one parameter which has lots of values, and maybe I only use 3 values in one event, or maybe I use 8 in the next one, but I can just use one parameter. Otherwise, you might end up with like 100 parameters in the game, and that's just impossible to keep up with. Have you shared your FMOD sessions with other members of the audio team on a repository? Are there any considerations for doing that? Do you share the entire project or just the sound banks? Yeah, if you're working with a team, then you share the entire FMOD project. And what I sometimes tend to do is just share the bank. So the bank file with the developers. Again, this is totally up to the workflow that you have. But sending a bank file is a lot easier and a lot simpler sometimes than sending the entire FMOD project, which ends up being gigabytes, right? But between the people in the audio team, yes, everybody has full access. So I will send it over on GitHub. I use GitKraken. Again, very intuitive. If anybody is thinking about getting into it, boom, that's GitKraken. Check that out. Yeah, share the whole event. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you here. I've got some examples in the other folder, which is really, really good. So yeah, we can discard all of that. Okay, FMOD. Ooh. FMOD, tips and tricks. Come here, FMOD. Forgetting how to use my own computer. What is going on? Okay. Everything's harder when you stream. Why is everything harder when you stream? Huh? Okay, everyone can still see this? I think we're good. I have to keep sharing this chat on the side. Cool. Okay, so in this project, I'm going to share a few like events. This is where we can kind of follow along if you want, if you've got FMOD open. If you've got FMOD open, we can kind of recreate a couple of these. Some of these are really, really cool. And again, they're all stolen. All these ideas are stolen from friends or colleagues or people I aspire to be, right? Which is fine. I'm not going to not use something if just because somebody else came up with it or told me about it. That the idea is that we are simply joining the conversation, right? We are following along with the things that have been proven, the things that already work. And then from there, that's where it gets interesting, because then we can take those ideas and change them and manipulate them to the thing that we have in front of us, the example or the project that we have in front of us. Cool. Anyway, right. Let's fly through some of these. So CPU considerations. For the most part, audio plays quite a small role when it comes to CPU usage, right? I think for the most part, developers are just upset when anything takes up their CPU more than it should. Audio started off being like nothing back in the day, back in like 8-bit, Super Mario days. So ever since then, I think maybe it's it's growing, obviously, but it's still tiny compared to like the graphics and the gameplay and the art and all of that stuff. Okay. However, we can still streamline things to make things, to make things more efficient. There's no need to put in things that are just there for the sake of it. So a couple of CPU considerations. FMOD should be used as a tool, right? We should be using FMOD to make our lives as easy as possible. Okay. Part of that means letting FMOD do the randomness for us. For instance, I have a bunch of tracks here. This is an MPC. You're not going to be able to hear it, but again, it sounds so good. I made the sound design. It's probably the best sound effect anybody's ever heard. Such a shame you can't hear it. It's made up of like several layers. Each one of these layers, each audio track within an event, this is the important thing, counts as a voice in the game engine. Okay? Each game engine, it has a voice count. I think in Unity it's set to like 128, something like that. Okay? And what that means is that every time one of these is played, it adds that voice count. If 128 sounds are playing at once, and then 129th sound wants to be played on top of it, it will basically cancel out one of the 128 below. Okay, so it's better that we don't hit that ceiling. If we do hit it, there's some considerations in FMOD that can help. I will get onto that in a minute. But for the most part, if we have, imagine, look, say 20 events with 6 layers or 5 layers like this one playing at the same time, and they're playing multiple times each, we can very quickly fill up this voice count, right? So what I propose, or again, what I've learned from people like Kevin, for instance, he does this a lot, is he will set this up in FMOD, and in each one of these multi-events, there's a single event normally, or you can add a multi-event instrument, sorry. Okay. Quite simply, a multi-instrument down here holds multiple audio files, right? Cool. Really simple. Just like a big random container that can then be shuffled. You can play it in order. You can randomize it, shuffle it, right? Very simple. The idea that, if you have a footstep, you'll put like 20 sound effects inside this multi-instrument and they'll each play at random. What I propose is that each one of these is a layer with several variations. You will screen record your computer, system record it with OBS or something stronger. Like some people connect their PC to their door to record all of the audio, and you'll just play it a bunch of times, right? Play it 20 times, play it 100 times. And then the idea is that we bake all of these sounds into one multi-instrument, which contains all of them, thus reducing the voice count, but you still don't sacrifice having the incredible like variations that you've created by having 5 layers. Does that make sense? Okay, CPU consideration. That's one way of doing it. Another instance, for instance, scatterer instruments. We have a whole bunch of instruments here. I really recommend you go on the FMOD page and you check them out, right? Single instruments we've covered, which is one of these. It just has one audio file. Multi, we've covered it in the previous one, right? Scatterer events is one of these green boys or green girls or green people, green things. Let's keep it things, right? And it has a whole bunch of stuff which is really, really, really cool, really interesting. You can basically vary the distance. It randomizes and varies the distance of which you hear a sound. So on the volume, the spawn rate, how many play at the same time, the polyphony, pitch randomization. It's just this crazy cacophony of like just all of these like little calculations happening like on the fly. Really, really cool. And it's really good for stuff like ambiances if you want really random sounds in the background. But again, if you want an ambience to have all that variation without having each of these scatter instruments playing, you can simply record this ambience, right? The top is a loop and these are just scatter instruments. You can record this for like, I don't know, 10 minutes. And then again, put that loop back into FMOD. Okay. Interesting thing that you might be able to experiment with. In any case, this also, using this method and recording it and then baking them here, imagine how long this would take you to make like 100 variations like this in your DAW, like by hand. I know there are softwares out there like Krotos that kind of does this for us now, but if you don't have this, then this is also an option. Okay. Cool. I don't know if there's any questions here that I've missed. Hopefully not. Cool. Oh yeah, there's a Spanish guide. Yeah, I remember that one. I think I've come across that on FMOD as well. Fantastic. Can you please explain the trigger behavior? What does it do when you add an event condition, stopping or not stopping? The trigger behavior. Sorry, where are we talking about here? Were we talking about in the scatter instrument? No. Sorry, completely lost. Oh, here we go. Right. Okay. Trigger behavior. Right down here. Sure. We can talk about that real quick. Basically, you can have an event play every time that it is selected, or you can turn on the probability. At the moment, it's 100%, so nothing's changed. 100% of the time, it will play, or I can lower it, which means every time that this is called upon, this event, there's a 44% chance of it playing, right? If you want something not playing that often, for instance. And also, if it's called upon like several times at once, if you have polyphony to infinite, that means it could play infinite times simultaneously, which is crazy. You might want to lower that as well. And in which case, you let FMOD decide whether you want to, I'm so close to hitting the stop sharing button. You let FMOD decide which one, how it should stop playing the previous one in order to make room for the next one, right? This is where you add parameters. We're not going to get into that today. I hope that explains a little bit. On the multi-instrument, sorry. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Cool. All right, real quick. Let's just fly through these and then we can get more questions in. Snapshots. There are 3 ways, I think, that you can implement the snapshots that we were talking about in the mixer window, right? these snapshots, there are 3 ways you can implement them in the game. The first one is super simple. Well, I've got an event, but it's not going to matter. Is adding reverb. You can simply give the developer the snapshot name, and they call upon it like an event instance in their code, in their script. In the same way that they would call footsteps to start playing, they just call the snapshot by the name, and it would start, right? Really straightforward, really simple way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, which could be quite interesting or useful for different scenarios. One of them is having a persistent event, which is really interesting. Down here, there are macros, event macros. Persistent means that this event, usually by default they're on off, because the idea that we want the event to play once and then turn off, right? Whenever it's called upon. So like a footstep, play once and then stop, especially with like loops, like ambiances. Having them on means they are on continuously. They get called at the start, like as the game with level loads, they get called upon and they are just on completely, which is another way of basically adding a parameter, which is up here, right? Which has 2 options, play or pause. And I've used this for the pause menu snapshot. If you remember that filter that we added, right? The idea that if it's on play, if the game is on play, nothing is playing. And if it's on pause, you can right click and you can find the snapshot that you've created in the mixer window and you can add it here, right? And it will add it. In a very similar way, you can add them into an event. If, for instance, you know that an event, for instance, like this footstep, if this particular footstep is playing, it's only ever going to be inside exterior reverb. I can add the snapshot as an instrument and just put it over the loop region, if it's a loop region. You can't hear it now, but this footstep is now playing with this reverb attached, right? Because in the mixer window, again, if you window, mixer, exterior reverb is adding a send to the gameplay sound effects, okay? Wherever this might be. Anyway, down here, right? Exterior reverb. Cool. So again, the easiest way is just calling it in the code. However, these might be useful for other instances. Cool. Magnet regions. Okay, again, I'm going through things that people don't often overlook or they haven't learned before because it's not like the obvious thing to learn. Magnets. Right? This is a typical music event without the use of magnet regions. We have the blue regions, which are loops. If I right click and I put new loop region, it simply adds a loop region that I can put around a file, right? That's it. Really simple. Whoops. And then up here, these are transition timelines. Again, right click and transition region. And then I can transition region, which means whilst it's in this loop, at any point along this transition region, if I set the parameter up here, which I've added to the values that I need to move to here, it will jump. Now, in this scenario, the music is jumping from loop A to loop B to loop C. However, because of the gameplay scenario that it's in, each one of these could jump to the other loop randomly. It doesn't go in order. It's not a linear soundtrack, right? I'm so glad somebody posted that. I'm so glad there are always Sunny fans in the chat. What's your favorite hobby? Magnets. Right. Me too, Charlie. So in order for it to jump from one track to the other, for instance, it could start here and then it could jump to track 3, then to 2, then back to 3, then back to 1. You have to add all of these transition regions, right? This is fine for just 3 loops, but imagine if you added like, I don't know, another 10 loops to the side. You'll end up having like 10 transition regions over each other, which gets a little bit complicated. In that scenario, using something like magnets, right? Which I will show you how to use. If you add a new loop region and you you click on it down here, you can change it from looping to magnet, right? Magnet essentially means that it will you're just, instead of the transition region telling FMOD to go over there, the magnets are attracting them and telling it to come over here, right? Which I've basically done what this has done with these 3 magnets instead. Super straightforward. I start playing it and I can just select loop 3. Oh, this is not set. Forgive me. I have to add the parameter condition. Set to loop 2. Back to loop 3. You just, right? It just drums. What else is really cool is down here, you can also set the magnets to have an offset. You can have relative offset, which means that if I transition from this magnet to this one, and I'm halfway, it will start halfway through this one, right? At least it should if all of them are selected to relative. Here we go. Here we go again. Start on 1, right? Which again could be really interesting in the given scenario. You can also invert that. So, you know, if it starts in the first 25%, it'll start in the last 25% of the following one. Okay. Yeah. So many people overlook magnets because they don't know them and they don't know how to use them, etc., etc. But there you go. In some scenarios, they could be very useful. Right. Powering through. Let's talk about something whilst I have time, because I'm conscious of the time that we have. Okay, this is really cool. This is taken from a friend of mine called Ali Tocher, who's a sound designer. He's awesome. He's from New Zealand, and he has worked on games like I Am Fish, Surgeon Simulator. He's currently working on Lunar Abyss with the folks over at Bonsai, and absolutely killing it. Ali showed me how to do this, and he was going to make a video for YouTube. I'm sure he's still going to make how to explain it, but I'm going to share this and give all the credit to Ali Tocher. Okay, there you go. If you ever wanted an event, for instance, in this scenario, an enemy is getting hit, and every time the enemy is getting hit, you have the sound of the sword, for instance, hitting them, and you also have a grunt from them going, oh, like a pain grunt, right? Like you've just hurt them, which is a very common scenario. However, what gets repetitive and fatiguing about this scenario is when there's no delay between each grunt, right? Usually in FMOD, it's quite easy to control the probability of a grunt being hit by going to the trigger behaviors and turning probability on. So I can turn this on 75%, which means that 1 out of every 4 times it won't play anything, which makes it sound more realistic, because maybe every time you're hitting something with a sword or a monster with a sword, it doesn't let out a cry for help, which is more natural. However, this still doesn't add a sense of timing, right? Because maybe one sword hits them harder than the other one, or, you know, naturally speaking, we don't get like it just doesn't sound natural, right? So the way around this in FMOD, the way that Ali showed me, is you create a multi-instrument inside of your event, okay? And then outside of it, we're going to go through this together real quick. This is a really interesting one. Here's a multi-event, okay? This is normally where I would put all of the events in, all of the sounds. To the right of it, I'm going to create something called an event instrument, which is this yellow thing, right? An event instrument. And down here, you can see it's created a nested event, which we can then call it something else, for instance, right? Or whatever, right? But it's created a nested event, which is what all of these are, right? So I've just gone here and I've just gone create event, create event, create event instrument as many times as I need them, right? Created all of these. Each one of these I've labeled a different type of delay. Each one of these has the same multi-instrument with all of the variations in slapped into it, right? The only difference is that in the first one, there's no delay along the timeline, right? It starts at 0. In the second one, there's a bit of a delay. And the third one is bigger, and the fourth one is even bigger. Then what I have done is in this, or the parent event, if you will, in this multi-instrument, I have dragged these nested events and slapped them in there, right? Now, if we go down here, what we have are the nested events, each with the same number of variations in each one of them, but being shuffled, right? Picked at random in this case, meaning that randomly speaking, every time it gets hit, it will choose from one of these boxes, and each one of these boxes has a different delay, right? Really, really cool. As soon as he taught me this, I was like, maybe this is obvious to other people. Maybe somebody already knows how to do this, but to me, this was like fantastic. This was like a solution that I had been looking for or hadn't spent enough time thinking about. Spatializer overview, we could go into this, but it's kind of harder without audio. But I'm basically, the thing to consider, the thing to remember is that your sound size down here has to be bigger than your distance attenuation. I have a really short video on my YouTube channel, by the way, which I'll link in a minute because it's got like a version of this free template to download for anybody. But essentially, you can set your minimum and max distances for where you hear the sound, and your sound size always has to be bigger. If it is not, up here in the overview, right, where we can preview the sound and how it will work, right? So like I can play this sound if it's a loop, for instance. I can move around the sound. The sound is in the center, and this is like the player, the listener walking past it. I can preview how it sounds. If the sound size down here is not double the minimum extent, then you're going to have that terrible like flying from one side of the ear to the other kind of thing, right? As you move from one to the other, as you move past it. So it needs to be slightly bigger. The idea that as you approach an object that has sound, it envelops you, right? It's not a point. If you're far away, if you're super far away, like I am from the mic, it becomes a point, right? It's super directional. You're like, somebody is shouting and they are like a mile away that way. I just hear the sound from that direction. If I'm like face to face with this person who is now shouting at me for some reason, the sound basically sounds stereo, right? Which is what the sound size is. By default, if you leave it on auto, FMOD takes care of this for you. But if you have to tweak it, which you often do, just make sure the sound size is at a reasonable size. And if you look at the overview, you can see it as this gray circle that's expanding, right? Cool. The other thing, for things like thunder, there's a dial here called minimum extent. Again, the idea that we want sounds to be directional, and sometimes we want them to envelop us, to sound bigger. Thunder is a really great example of this. Thunder very far away still sounds like it's enveloping us to some extent, right? That's how it sounds big. I think it's very rare that the thunder sounds like it's coming from like 1 point away from you, right? It's because it's such a big mass of sound. For that reason, this minimum extent dial, and you can see it again in the overview up here on the right, is a white line going around it. Basically means that no matter how far away it is, no matter what volume it is, it will still sound like it's taking up more degrees of my envelopment, my stereo field. In this case, like, I don't know, 200 degrees more or less. Okay? Sounding bigger. Really quick considerations that I think are really useful. Really sorry we didn't get the audio to play. Maybe I'll post a video of what I've done, but basically I took, if anybody knows Jeff Plays Guitar, who does a bunch of Doom covers of various music and stuff like that, he's fantastic. I've basically taken a track that he made for YouTube, which was a linear track, and I've basically shown you that FMOD can edit a track and create an adaptive system out of it. The idea that FMOD, again, should be used as a tool, that there is nothing wrong with using FMOD and editing things. Right? Editing audio files, not having to just export them ready-made from your DAW and put them into FMOD and expect it to be perfect. Because the most time wasted, I think, in a project is going from your middleware to your DAW and back and forth. Right? You export a sound, you test it in FMOD, it's not quite right, you go back to your DAW, you try it again, and you put it back in. If you have to keep jumping back and forth, it's very time-consuming. FMOD allows us, thankfully, to limit that sort of thing by fixing things there on the fly, by, you know, adding plugins for live processing, adding crossfades if we need them to, splitting things, you know, cutting things as you would do in a DAW. And I think we should use this. So long as we take into consideration the CPU usage, which again is very minimal, but there are also ways around it if we need it. It's definitely the way to use it, in my opinion. I've created this really cool system, so I will definitely post a video of this just like playing through. But essentially, I have nested events for each stage of this combat. I have like menu, loading, exploration, combat, and then some victory stingers. With the use of nested events, like we used in the other event in the where do we use it? Random delays one. And so each one of these nested events, if I double click it, I can put my own a little adaptive system within another event, which makes things a lot neater because it means that the main event looks like this and I can follow what I'm doing. And it means that I can add another layer of controllability within each one of these nested events. Oops, sorry, down here, right? Each one of these is different. Cool. See, I've crossfaded a bunch of things. I've just basically bounced this track out, cut it where I wanted to and then crossfaded it to create a loop that I think is interesting as an adaptive thing. Okay. I'll make a video, I'll post it, and then we'll go from there. Cool. One other thing, maybe before we completely stop, use the seek speed function if you haven't already. Okay, especially for beginners. If you want to delay a parameter having an effect on something, it's called seek speed. Up here, I have a parameter called switch. If I click on it, which is it's just from count from 0 to 1, right? If I click on it like I've done, I zoom out and I zoom back down, back in, back down here, seek speed comes up. Seek speed at the moment is set to instant, which means the effect that I have on this track, which is a reverb, right? If you look down here on the wet value, it's going up as I move this parameter up, right? It's just adding reverb to this track slowly. At the moment, as I change the value, it will jump to that value of the reverb straight away, right? You'll see it in action. If I add a loop region, I press play, I start at 0 and I change it to 0.5. If I change it to 1, look at the wet value jump. And on and off, which for me in this case, in this made up scenario, is unnatural. So I want that. And if you see, you can see that little orange dot as it moves, right? Playing. See the orange dot on the wet value? Happening instantly. It sounds unnatural to jump that instantly. So what I'm going to do is just turn the seek speed up, which is basically the time it takes for the parameter to change from the value it was starting at to the value you want it to go to. See how it moves slower there? You can make it more pronounced if you want. Look, 10 seconds to get from one to the other. Watch the orange value on the reverb again. Oh, that's quicker. Or you can make it slow. Look. Right? Cool. I think that's the thing that I would have wanted to have heard if I was learning FMOD for the first time. Okay, I appreciate that I've kind of rushed through a lot of this, but I didn't want to go over time. Can you explain how to make a transition with magnets and maintain the musicality of the soundtrack? I don't know if you have any tips or tricks. I would first suggest that if you're using magnets, Adrian, great question, is make sure that it's arrhythmic, that there's no rhythm to it, first of all. If it's just like ambient pads from one to the other, then it doesn't matter where it changes because it doesn't have to be in time. The other one is to have a really strict beat to it. Maybe. It's hard to say. All I know is that if music calls for it, magnets are a really efficient way of jumping from one to the other. I think it'll work really well if you're having to start the next loop at the start, right? Or like I said, if you have the beats perfectly in sync, like the same tempo, the same kind of beat on every track, if it's halfway through a track and then it has to jump halfway to the next track, it will work because you have the magnets doing so, right? I'd say that's the first one you have to consider. The other thing you have to consider using magnet regions, which I didn't discuss, is that you can't add a transition timeline. The transition timeline only adds which is another way of adding, for instance, a crossfade from one to the other, will only work for, again, this is easier if I showed you with sound, but basically we'll only add a crossfade going to this magnet region. Whereas in transition regions, if I'm jumping from this loop 1 to loop 3, I can go to the loop 3 transition region, right click, add transition timeline, and then in between the tracks, I can simply drag out a transition for that specific transition, right? Meaning that the transition from loop 1 to loop 2, which is tackled by this one, loop 2 transition region, can have a completely separate crossfade, right? If I wanted to have, I don't know, the destination start at full volume and the source fade out like a reverb tail. That's another consideration. Magnet regions aren't good for that, okay? Hopefully that sends you in a different direction. I don't think it is possible to adjust the length of the beginning of a file in FMOD. Yes, you can shorten it at the end, but occasionally it has a bit of space. Yeah. What Ariel is talking about, which is absolutely correct, is if I wanted to, I can make this shorter, right, to the beginning. However, if I wanted to like take, if I bring it this way, FMOD kind of does this weird thing where it doesn't let you do that. Essentially, I can't take like the middle of this unless I split it. If I split it like this, then you can do that, Ariel. Right? Now I've got a little bit in the middle. Otherwise you couldn't. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's what you're talking about. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think I just answered your question in a different way. Start offset, something that Alex Cole is talking about, is also really cool. Start offset. If you click on any event instrument, like one of these blue things here, and you go down to here, start offset, you can start the event or the audio file at a different percentage start. So I can start it half. Not that. I can start this by putting 50%. I can start it halfway, which means every time that this event is played up here, it will start halfway. You can also randomize this and anything, by the way. Add modulation and random. Over here on the right pops up a start offset. I can randomize pretty much any parameter, any plugin with right-clicking and adding modulation random. There's also LFOs you can add, right? Which is what I did to Jeffrey's music in one of these. I believe it was menu. Yeah, this layer, noise. I've added a flanger, and I've also added an LFO, which is just messing everything up, right? Messing the panning, messing the flanger rate. Again, it sounds great. I wish you could hear it. Cool. Hassan, you said, question, how do you have the sound play through until it finishes, even after you stop an event, like not have it cut off immediately before you finish? Yes. Okay. I understand exactly what you mean. For instance, this particular part of music has that in action. If you click on the event and you go down here and press async, normally it's like this. You press async. Again, I don't know why FMOD has decided to change the visuals, but anyway, there is music, there is sound here. I don't know what the visuals are doing. It basically means that as this jumps from this to marker B, which is over here, which you'll see in a minute, you'll see a little white playhead still play, which means even though the cursor, which is this big one here, has moved position, this async feature means that this event will play to its entirety, even though something else might be playing on top. So you'll see, look, this is now playing. The white cursor represents where it's at in the event. This cursor now is going to jump to marker B, which is starting this event, but the previous one is still being played. I hope that makes sense. Can FMOD use third-party VST plugins? Some people make FMOD third-party VST plugins. Yes. At the moment, the big ones, the official ones, are stuff like Resonance Audio, which is basically used to, see if I remember where to find it. Resonance Audio down here, which is basically to help with 3D implementation. However, any other third-party ones aren't really maintained because they're just community made or like amateur made. So you run the risk. Everybody I've spoken about, including like Kevin in his latest GDC talk for Tunic, which again, I recommend you all go and have a look in the Tunic, in the GDC Vault for free. They found really cool third-party plugins, but they decided not to use it because at the end of it, if there wasn't an update to the plugin or it stopped working for whatever reason because the person who made it just didn't have time, for instance, you'd be pretty screwed. You'd be in a bad position, right? Especially if you relied on it. So at the moment, there's only stuff officially for like implementation stuff like a VR, because technically speaking, we didn't have time to go into this. There are two 3D implementation plugins. Object Spatializer is the standard one. It pretty much takes care of everything, all your needs, which is the one that we looked at. FMOD Spatializer, however, allows the use of these third-party plugins in the game engine or somewhere else to create an even more immersive experience. However, that is very specific to the game. So in order to make your decision, for the most part, Object Spatializer works with pretty much any scenario. How would you go about implementing a weapon, the handling sound, charge, shoot, and launch? I would separate every single one of those, Helly. Every single one of those. Normally, it's like build up, hit, and then maybe a tail. the reason I would do that is because I know that the animations might change. And at the start, especially when I was like working on Elder Souls, John and Francesco would come up with this really cool character design and animation. I would create a linear sound for that in my DAW and export that whole sound and play it as one event. And then they'd be like, actually, they wouldn't say anything. I'd be playing the game and I'm like, oh, this is completely out of time now. And I'd have to go back in my DAW, rebake it, and create a new sound, which was just crazy long. So instead, I separate it to build up, hit, and tail, meaning, oh, the timing has changed? No problem. I'll just move the build up or I'll move the hit, right? So yeah, always separate, always separate. Also because of the mix. If you're in the final stages of the mix and you decide, oh, the build up is getting in the way of this other sound effect, you can just turn the build up on its own. Whereas if it's baked in, you'll have to go back to your DAW again and re-export it, which is time consuming. Magnets seem good to deal with sudden changes in dialogue. Don't know if that's one way to use it. That could work, but usually dialogue is like a separate. Dialogue can be used with something called, let's not confuse things. I'll create a new event, new timeline sheet, new audio track. They can be used with something called a programmer instrument. Commands is something whole other thing we didn't get a chance to talk about. Program instrument can basically connect with a folder on your computer full of all the dialogue lines, like all the separate audio files, and you can just tell FMOD to connect to each file based on their name. And usually what happens is if a dialogue needs to jump from one to the other, it just stops playing the previous one in a smooth way. You can implement it and then jumps to the next one. But who knows? Maybe there's a scenario where magnets could be useful. Question, how do you set up a delay between a thunder sound and the actual thunder light in the game, depending on the distance of the player from that event? Fantastic question, Renard. There's a number of ways you could do that, really dependent on the situation that you have at hand. The delay could be programmed. It could be attached to an animation or an object, a hidden object in the game engine, if you understand what I mean, that just appears a certain time afterwards. You could handle it in FMOD with a parameter. So I could set up a parameter up here, which is continuous. For instance, let's call it thunder distance and set it from a range from 1 to, I don't know, 10 miles. Meaning that the volume can start at very low when it's like, very high when you're really close to it. And over the other side at 10, it could be very low, meaning that I can tell the coder essentially to attach this parameter to the player's position relative to that thunder. And if they're, 6 miles away, it will be this volume. If they're 10 miles, it will be this volume. That's another way of doing it. Really depends. Okay, I've been told I need to stop at like an hour 20. So again, really sorry we didn't get to play the audio. I hope you picked up at least one or two things that maybe at least, have an idea to explore moving forwards. I'm going to stop sharing now. In any case, yeah, thank you so much for joining me. Again, if you wanted to download a version of the project I just showed you, I have that on YouTube, just free to download. I don't think there are enough FMOD templates out there for people to download and to use. Like I said, on the FMOD Learn tab, which I'm going to share right now, there is the entire Celeste FMOD project. I highly recommend you just download it and just rummage around in there, take ideas, steal ideas. That's the idea of it. And Kevin also has a Twitch stream. If you go on Power Up Audio's Twitch stream, literally type up Power Up Audio Twitch. Again, I'm going to share that with you now. He has like a 3-hour stream where he just goes through like the whole FMOD project, just explains what they were doing at the time. Really, really good. If you're serious about learning FMOD, do it. Final thing, pick a middleware and get really good at it. Like dive deep into it, right? Be really good at just one of them. That's fine. Pick your path. Like I said, if you want to go in-house, choose Wise. If you don't care, choose the one that suits you and get really good at that one. The principles of it, the implementation ideas from it is the most important thing, I think, out of it, right? Learning what is possible based on the software that you're using. Cool. I hope you enjoy this. This was super on the fly, off the cuff, just vibing with everything. And yeah, thanks a lot for coming. thanks a lot for supporting Aircon. I've absolutely loved it. Greg and Lewis have made an amazing thing. I'm sure everybody agrees. Terrible jokes going on in the chat. Also, it is pronounced wise, not W-wise, not w-wise, like some people might think. That's coming from like an official engineer technician from Wise, by the way, from Audio Kinetic. Okay, cool. All right, thanks everyone. Have a fantastic weekend. Stay safe. Take it easy.